We talk about foreign-born priests in the United States, and people look at me and they don't think I'm foreign-born. Actually, largely it's because I'm white, and I speak, after having been in the United States for quite a number of years, there's not much of my accent left. In some of our parishes, I mean, we have a significant number of people who are undocumented, who are trying to go through the process. And for people who come, who are immigrants, we have this picture that's presented of they're freeloaders, they're this, they're that, and so on. People don't appreciate how much, in one level, courage it takes to be an immigrant. In one sense, there are people who fleeing, if you don't leave, you're all going to get slaughtered. So that's a strong imperative. But there's another level where people look and say, there has to be more than life to what we're experiencing, or we want to build a better life for our children. I mean, every human being, I think, agrees with that. We want our children to have a better life than we do, and we'll sacrifice for that. And so when you move from one country to another, that takes a level of risk, or in a sense, entrepreneurial spirit, that in order to do that. And I think that's why the United States has become the nation it's become. When you come to another country from your country of origin and start a new life, it's not as simple as people think it is. Because when you live in your country of origin, there's like this backdrop or curtain, and you're sort of embedded and woven into it. And that curtain is all the sort of cultural things, all the normal life things that are just fundamentally part of the air that you breathe and the water that you swim in, so to speak. And now you pull yourself out of that and you put yourself up against another backdrop that has, at times, quite different air and water and so on. And you don't just fit in. In my case, because I spoke Commonwealth English, I was able to adapt to the United States fairly easily. For people like the Mexican immigrants or Latin American immigrants or Asian immigrants, having to adapt to a new language adds a much greater level of complication to it. But for example, the things that you eat, the things that you joke about, the things that are important in the culture, they aren't here. So where do you find those? So I came in through the legal immigration process, but it was arduous to say the least. When I first arrived here in the US, I came on a visitor's visa to visit the community that I'm part of, and then decided very quickly, it became clear that I should pursue staying here long term. So that began this whole process. So you'd think it was, a person with a religious commitment who's come to join a religious community, what today we call the R1 visa, would be pretty easy. But back then, there was some technicality that they refused to grant me that. We began this long process to try and get permanent residency, or as people you would call it today, the green card. It's not really green, it's more like a pinkish hue and so on. But every avenue that we took to try and get that, we were just blocked. I mean, it was bureaucracy at its finest. If the thing fits clearly within a category, the answer is okay. But if it doesn't, and there's some gray areas or they're not sure, bureaucrats tend to be conservative. We had to go and get a lawyer, immigration lawyer from Chicago, who said that some of the advice we had been given was not accurate, and they were painting the picture far more dismally for us than we thought. So we began to work with him, and he said this will take about 2.5 years. Well, it took almost 5. Left the country, came back in, arrived at Chicago. I still remember this pretty well. And I and one other fellow, it turns out an Iranian, were pulled out of the line and sent into the interrogation rooms. An Iranian and a South African. So both of us were on the not good guys list for the United States. Official came in and I wouldn't say screamed at me for an hour, but used a very intense, powerful tone of voice and posture in his questioning of me. I was threatened with deportation. They were threatening to do all kinds of things to me, and I kept on arguing with them, or at least my answer to them was, look, what more could I as a reasonable man do? It was fairly intimidating at the time, at the middle of it, but I kept sticking to my guns because I knew I'd done everything I could. Turns out their office had forgotten to tell me to get one more piece of information. So, but that wasn't on me, but they kept on putting it back on me. So eventually the fellow comes back and he says to me, "This is your lucky day. You know, my supervisor has decided to grant you a visa waiver. So if you I have your passport, I need $15 to pay for the visa waiver." And something in the back, I almost said, wait, this is not my fault. But this voice in the back of my head said, be quiet, give him the money and move on. Because of my circumstances, I was not permitted to leave the United States until its completion. So that was nearly 5 years, and during that time 3 of my siblings got married. I was not able to go home for their weddings. My grandmother died. I had to play by the rules, and it was at times fairly challenging. When I got there, I arrived in the morning and checked in. They took my information. Okay, thank you, come back at noon. So we hung around Johannesburg for a few hours, came back at noon, and I went up to the counter, and the person said, "Okay, Mr. Smith, etc., stamps the passport and says, "Have a good trip." And I sort of said, "Wait, aren't you guys supposed to have a fairly intense interview with me?" And the consular official looked at me and started laughing. "Oh, no, you're fine." So I felt like I had been climbing this mountain with all these setbacks all the way along. And here I am looking at the summit, and it's the last arduous trek to the summit. And they said, "Oh, no, you can just walk up." I got my permanent residency in the United States. And so then there's a 5-year period before you can become a citizen. I did have a network of relationships and all these things around me that helped me as I went through this. Whereas if you come in as a refugee or somebody with no support, that just complicates the whole situation. There's a lot of stress when you've been living in a way of life and you understand all these things, and then you move to a new way of life. At one point I remember I wanted to send a telegram, so I went to the post office and they laughed at me. "Oh no, that's Western Union. In South Africa, post office does telegrams." Yes. So I became a US citizen here in Portland with about 150 something people at a government office near the Lloyd Center was where they did the swearing in. It was fascinating to see them. Most people from third world countries. At the time, the church, the archdiocese, was in a pretty major spat with the state of Oregon. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, we're going to go into this interview. So we were all praying fairly hard. So I went in to the interview, and this lady came out. There was just a pile of files. She just stuck her hand and pulled one. It was mine. Called me in and sat down. She starts paging through the file and looking at me, and she says, "Oh, I see you're a seminarian studying to become a Catholic priest," or something like that. So it's like, okay, here we go. And then she looked up and smiled, and she said, "I think that's wonderful." At the end of it, I just said to her, "Ma'am, I have to tell you, you've completely changed or at least seriously changed my view of the immigration process and immigration authorities, because up till now it hasn't been real good." There's an element of all these people who have come to the United States that I think we should harness for the good of the country and the culture. There's the support of friends and the prayers of friends through this whole process was key. There was one moment I remember where I was ready to give up. So don't despair, don't give up. Keep working until we find the way.